sprint over to the stage here. Thank you very much, Sophie, for that introduction. I was very excited because Sophie said to me, oh, you can come actually and you can kind of, be like an outsider, insider, and you can kind of offer up some provocations. And I was like, yeah, I could do that. I could do provocations. And then the problem is, of course, that I get here and I realize that I know some of you. And in fact, not only do I know some of you, but in fact, what I was thinking about, I could be, just an outsider and I could just say stuff. And I realized that in fact, I feel very much like an insider because I can empathize a great deal with a lot of the stuff that you are talking about. So anyway, I'm still going to try and offer up some provocations around this particular question of, how we are able to use the capabilities of research in universities, link that with the capabilities of communities, and kind of, offer up some kind of collective imaginings for our future. I want to start by saying two things. First is that actually, you may expect this, but I am going to draw in particular on ideas that are exercised in the organizations that I'm working with at the moment. And the other thing is I want to surface an assumption which is kind of pervading our conversation, but I think it's probably worth just being articulate about this. So when we talk about capabilities in the community or community assets, we're not talking really about infrastructure here, we're talking about people. That we're talking about the social capital, we're talking about the skills, we're talking about the knowledge or knowledges, the networks, etc. that they have. Now, the way that I've thought of approaching this is actually, I'm going to describe some assets and then take a moment to reflect about what that might mean for the challenge that's before us. And I'm going to start actually by also apologizing a little bit because this is going to be fairly cursory. But I used to work in radio and I really do not want to go over time. So I'm going to be trying to kind of keep it light, keep it cute, keep it quick, and smile sweetly at Sean here so that she doesn't usher me off. Okay, so the first category of assets actually, which I want to reference is around this idea that communities have narratives. And here I want to lean into some work that's been done around what's called story listening by two researchers, Sarah Dillon and Claire Craig, who are based in Oxford and Cambridge respectively. And what they're talking about with story listening is this institutional act of gathering narrative evidence. And what's really interesting for me is that it kind of responds to what Cassie was saying about the imaginative leaps that are required in our public reasoning and our policy making. And so to describe what this story listening involves, it's really kind of two areas, right? So you have the first area, which is around scoping narratives. And by narratives, just imagine cultural texts. So it could be films, it could be books, it could be plays. Indeed, it could be journalism. So you're scoping narratives that might actually offer you new frames of reference of what the issue might be. So a really useful example is around artificial intelligence. So, it's this idea of moving away from just thinking about humanoid artificial intelligence kind of in a factory or basically in a value chain, and thinking about new types of intelligence when you look at stories that offer up actually artificial intelligence as relates to aliens, for instance. But it's also really useful in terms of thinking about how it identifies, articulates collective identities. It's also very helpful to think about how it creates and informs models that allows us to collectively think through implications. In fact, one might argue that it's very difficult to do that without models. And it's also thinking about narratives that offer new and rigorous anticipations. So that's a kind of a scoping exercise, where, as I say, you kind of look through cultural texts for that kind of stuff. And the other is around critiquing dominant stories. And the idea here is that there are certain stories, they could say, that are charismatic, and that they suck the oxygen out of the room, they draw attention to themselves, and crucially, they preclude us from conceiving of other futures and other possibilities because we become so fixated on them. And I think a really good and quite topical example of that is this narrative around COVID as a uniquely public health crisis. And it took us a while to start to realize, oh, wait a minute, actually there's crisis that's going on across a variety of sectors. The other thing about these kind of charismatic stories and dominant stories is that they often tend to privilege particular collective identities. And here, an example actually, which Sarah uses, is Jane Austen novels, actually, and how they tend to privilege a particular idea of middle-class England from the 18th century. And it makes no reference at all, for instance, to slavery and colonization, which was actually very alive and present, and in fact critical to those social models at the time. So what does this mean for the challenge before us? It's about creating what we call narrative literacy. It was really interesting that they're very careful to say this is not about storytelling, it's about story listening. And I think this is extremely important when we're thinking about public engagement, about communication, that we have to really be able to start developing conceptual tools that are not just about the telling, the delivery, but also thinking about the receiving, the understanding, the meaning making. And that involves understanding that stories can operate in ways that are rational, and I use that in inverted commas, that there's a whole set of expertise that can and should be developed around this, and that we need to spend some time thinking about our own narratives and the narratives of the communities that we're engaging with. Okay, on to the second idea. Communities have capacities for reasoning. And that might seem fairly obvious. And I want to start actually by continuing from the previous point, as it were, and to introduce this idea of the marketplace of narratives. We often think actually that, for instance, the development of the internet age has led to what we call echo chambers, and that basically you have these groups that are just listening to each other. And in fact, the empirical evidence is now beginning to suggest that is not in fact what is happening, that people are actually exposed to all sorts of narratives, but what they do is that they make choices which are based not only on the affective impact, which is say how they respond emotionally, but also the cognitive resonance. How does it actually relate to what they see of their worldview? I think this is an enormously important idea for us to engage with. The other thing I want to talk about here is actually something from my own theatre practice. In Wretched Theatre, we draw a lot on what we call theatre for development. And this is actually, for some of you, you might be familiar with Augusto Bal, the Brazilian theatre maker, and he basically developed what is really a collection of techniques. It's called Theatre for Development, and it's really about engaging dialogue with communities. And one of these techniques is called forum theatre. And what is it, the point here is that actually it allows spectators to literally take over the narrative in a dramatization. And in doing that allows us to explore different possibilities about how shifts in power or actions for change would actually play out based on the reality and experience of the community. And he describes it basically as the flow of power between the citizen and institutions, and in fact would apply this in all sorts of contexts. And actually now, since the 1970s, it's been applied in lots of different ways. And he has a lovely quote that talks about stories are turned into public collective dramas. The point about this is twofold. First is that we need to understand that these communities understand power, they understand agency, and they understand aspiration. Do we understand that they understand that, is the question it poses. And also that there is an enormous body of empirical evidence around how this is applied to policy making, to public reasoning, and to the results that come out of this. It was actually really encouraging to hear Stephen talking so much about power in the context of research funding. So what does this mean for our collective challenge? I want to talk about something which I know is exercising some of you, and it's brand values. And one of the things here is recognizing that communities are now very sophisticated. It's not enough to talk about what your brand is, you have to demonstrate it. I was at a conference recently with BBC, Storyworks, we have a project with, and they're full of stories around brands failing because actually they talk about making their logos better, their mottos better, and then fail to actually walk it. It's not enough to talk about it, you have to do it to demonstrate what you're trying to do. Then the other thing is I want to talk about a quote, and I have a little slide here from Andres Raldo, who is at Parque Explora, which is a science museum in Medellin. And he says, science engagement is not meant only for discovery and economic development, but also for making healthier communities, interacting in more diverse and inclusive ways, and exploring the possibility of building new narratives as a society. The final point, because I know that I'm now almost out of time, is that communities are located. And that is not to say obviously only in space, but also in history and in relation to your own research institution. And this includes even in the digital space. right? And if I had a penny for every time I have been in a research institutional context and I've heard people talk about the public, the audience, even the policymakers, I'd probably be on a yacht in the Caribbean right now. So the point is here, in terms of what this means for challenges, is more self-awareness, to descend to yourself, to think about transdisciplinarity, because actually we need to understand the complexity of the reality that we're working in, and not just, of course, the disciplinary position of the research that's been funded. And also the importance of working with intermediaries for mutual access, crucially. And even, dare I say, considering ourselves as intermediaries. Thank you.